There are moments in long-running stories where everything feels like it's holding its breath. Not because something dramatic has already happened, but because everyone knows something could happen next. And today feels like one of those moments. Because today, Patrick Roark is expected to walk into court again. Not as a commentator, not as someone filming updates about the Whittaker family, but as a defendant. Right now, according to what's been circulating, Patrick is under home confinement. That means he isn't sitting in a jail cell, but he also isn't free to move around the way he used to. Instead, there's a device attached to his ankle, an electronic monitor, a piece of technology that quietly tells authorities exactly where someone is and whether they've stepped outside the boundaries they are allowed to occupy. For some people, that kind of monitoring feels humiliating. For others, it feels like a second chance, because the alternative would be simple. A jail cell, locked doors, no ability to go home, no ability to sleep in your own bed. So in many ways, an ankle monitor represents something strange. Punishment and mercy at the same time. And that's where Patrick stands right now. At home. Restricted. Waiting for court. But the real question today is not just whether he appears in court. It's what happens when he does. Because this is not just another routine hearing. The charges connected to the Whittaker case are serious. And every appearance in front of a judge carries the possibility of a new decision. Could the judge decide Patrick violated conditions? Could the judge decide he should remain under home confinement? Could the judge decide it's time for jail? All of those possibilities exist. And that uncertainty is exactly why today matters. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we need to step back and remember how this situation even began. For more than 70 years, the Whittaker family lived together in rural Appalachia. Their home was an odd, a small community, a place where life moved slowly, a place where the family had remained together for generations. They faced challenges, poverty, health issues, isolation, but through all of it, they stayed together. For decades. Then the internet arrived, and with it came attention. Millions of viewers learned about the family after their story was shared publicly by Mark Laita. Those videos sparked sympathy. They also sparked controversy. Some people believe the attention brought help. Others believed it turned a vulnerable family into a spectacle. But no one expected what would happen next. More people began visiting the Whittakers. Some wanted to help. Some wanted to film. Some wanted to investigate. And two names eventually became central to the controversy. Patrick Roark and Eric. Together, they entered the Whittaker story claiming they wanted to help the family. At least, that's how it appeared at first. They filmed. They posted updates. They talked about improving the situation. And many viewers believed them. People donated money. People followed the updates. People believed the family might finally receive stability. But something else was happening at the same time. Reports were being filed. Authorities were being contacted. And eventually Adult Protective Services stepped in. When that happened, the entire situation changed overnight. Members of the family were removed from the property. The household that had existed for decades was suddenly divided. And the internet began asking the same question. Why? Why now? Why after 70 years? Supporters of Patrick and Eric argued that intervention was necessary. They claimed the family needed protection. Critics argued something very different. They said the intervention destroyed a family that had lived together their entire lives. They said outsiders had interfered with something they didn't understand. And those two narratives have been fighting each other ever since. But the most difficult part of this story may be something simpler. The outcome. Because right now, the Whittaker family is no longer living the way they once did. They are separated, under supervision, living in different circumstances, and the promise that everything would improve remains uncertain. That's why the legal case against Patrick has become so important. For some people, the charges represent accountability. For others, they represent a warning about what happens when internet crusades go too far. But regardless of opinion, the legal process now controls what happens next. And that process begins again today. Patrick walks into court wearing an ankle monitor, a reminder that his freedom is conditional, a reminder that every decision now belongs to the judge. Some believe he will simply plead not guilty and receive another court date. Others believe the judge may decide something more serious. But until that courtroom door opens and the hearing begins, no one truly knows what will happen. One thing is certain. Whatever decision comes next will echo far beyond Patrick himself. Because the Whittaker story is no longer just about a family in the hills of Appalachia. It has become a national conversation about responsibility, exploitation, and the consequences of turning real lives into internet narratives. And today may be another chapter in that story. But it will not be the final one. Because as long as questions remain about what happened to the Whittaker family, and whether their lives were truly improved or irreversibly disrupted, the debate will continue. While Patrick Roark prepares to face the court under home confinement, another name continues to echo through the entire Whittaker controversy. Eric. Depending on who you ask, Eric is either the person who exposed a dangerous situation or the person who set in motion the events that tore a family apart. And the truth of that question has become one of the most debated points in the entire Whittaker story. To understand why Eric's role matters so much, you have to return to the moment when the Whittaker household first became the focus of outside intervention. For decades, the family lived together quietly and odd. Their home wasn't glamorous. It wasn't comfortable by modern standards. But it was their home. It was where Lorraine lived. It was where Timmy lived. It was where multiple members of the family shared the same space and the same routines they had followed for years. Then suddenly, people from outside the family began arriving. Some came because they had seen videos online. Some came because they believed they could help. And others came because they believed the situation required intervention. Eric was one of the people who entered that environment during that time. At first, his involvement looked similar to many others. He filmed. He talked about improving conditions. He spoke about making sure the family received support. But gradually, something else began happening. Authorities began receiving reports. Adult protective services became involved. And eventually, state agencies removed several members of the Whittaker household from the property. That moment changed everything. Because once APS intervenes, the situation moves into an entirely different category. Legal oversight, medical evaluation, placement decisions, and confidentiality laws that limit what information the public can see. Almost immediately after that intervention, people began arguing about who was responsible for initiating the investigation. Some supporters of Eric claimed he had courageously reported dangerous conditions. They argued that someone needed to step forward if the family's living situation posed health or safety risks. Others strongly disagreed. They argued that Eric exaggerated problems in order to justify outside involvement. Some critics claimed that Eric made it sound as if he personally triggered the investigation that led to the Whittakers being removed from their home. But according to other sources, that may not be the full story. Some reports suggest that another individual, someone connected to online coverage of the case, may have helped bring information to state authorities. That claim, if accurate, complicates the narrative significantly, because it means the investigation might not have been started by a single person at all. Instead, it may have been the result of multiple reports reaching state officials. And that distinction matters, because in situations involving vulnerable adults, authorities are required to investigate credible reports of neglect or abuse. Once those reports are filed, agencies cannot simply ignore them. They must assess the situation. They must determine whether intervention is necessary. And if they believe someone is at risk, they have the authority to act. But even when agencies act with good intentions, the consequences can be enormous. In the Whittaker case, the biggest consequence was the separation of the household. For the first time in decades, the family was no longer living together under the same roof. That decision remains one of the most controversial aspects of the entire situation. Supporters of the intervention argue that the family needed medical attention and structured care that could not be provided in the home. Critics argue that removing people from the only environment they have ever known can cause emotional trauma. Both perspectives exist in many cases involving vulnerable adults. Because the question is rarely simple. What does better actually mean? Better healthcare? Better living conditions? Better supervision? Or simply the ability to remain with the people you love? Those definitions can clash, and they often do. What makes the Whittaker situation even more complicated is the role of internet exposure. Before the story became widely known online, the family lived largely outside public attention. But once millions of viewers became invested in their lives, every decision affecting them became a subject of debate. When Eric appeared in videos discussing the situation, many viewers believed he was acting as an advocate for the family. Others saw something different. They believed he was using the situation to build attention and influence. These conflicting interpretations created a divide that still exists today. And even now, months later, questions remain unanswered. Was Eric acting primarily out of concern? Was he acting out of frustration with the conditions he saw? Or was he motivated by something else entirely? Those questions may eventually be addressed through legal proceedings, testimony, and documentation. Because although Patrick currently faces charges connected to the Whittaker situation, many observers believe the story does not end with him. Some believe Eric could eventually face scrutiny as well. Others believe that no charges will ever be filed against him. And even if no charges appear, that does not mean the debate about his role will disappear. Public opinion rarely settles quickly in cases like this, especially when video evidence, online commentary, and personal testimony all point in different directions. Another reason Eric remains central to the story is the emotional impact his actions appear to have had on viewers who supported the Whittakers. Many people donated money believing they were helping the family remain together and improve their living conditions. When the family was separated instead, those supporters felt confused and betrayed. They began asking questions. Where did the money go? Why was the family removed? Was the intervention necessary? Or was it avoidable? Those questions continue circulating today, and they are unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Because the Whittaker story represents something larger than a single legal case. It represents the collision between internet activism and real-world consequences. People online believed they were witnessing a mission to help a struggling family. But when that mission led to legal investigations, family separation, and criminal charges, the narrative became far more complicated. That complexity is exactly why Patrick's court appearance today matters so much. Because every legal development adds new information to a story that many people still struggle to understand. And while Patrick stands before the judge wearing an ankle monitor, Eric's role in the events leading to this moment remains one of the biggest unresolved questions. In the Whittaker story, one thing keeps coming up again and again. The videos. Not rumors. Not emails. Not screenshots. The videos. Because for many viewers, the strongest opinions about what happened were formed by watching what unfolded on camera. When Patrick and Eric began filming around the Whittaker home in Odd, audiences didn't just hear explanations. They saw things. They saw conversations. They saw interactions between visitors and family members. They saw the way people spoke to each other. And those moments are what many people now point to when they talk about exploitation. For some viewers, the footage looked uncomfortable, not because someone was shouting or threatening anyone, but because the dynamic felt uneven. On one side were people who understood the internet, understood monetization, understood audiences. On the other side were members of a family who had spent most of their lives outside that world. That imbalance is what many critics focus on. Because when someone films vulnerable individuals who may not fully understand how widely those images will spread, ethical questions naturally appear. But the other side of the argument is just as strong. Supporters of the people filming say those videos showed the truth. They say the footage revealed the living conditions the family had been enduring for years. They say that without those recordings, no one would have understood how serious the situation might have been. And that argument carries weight too, because video documentation can expose problems that would otherwise remain hidden. That is why documentaries and investigative reporting exist in the first place, to bring attention to situations that require help. But the Whittaker case sits in a very uncomfortable space between those two ideas. Was the filming documentation, or was it exploitation? The answer depends on who you ask. Some viewers point to specific moments in the footage where they believe the family appeared confused or uncomfortable. Others point to moments where the family laughed, interacted, and seemed happy to engage with visitors. Those conflicting interpretations have fueled endless debates online. And that debate intensified once money entered the conversation. Because when viewers began donating funds to help the Whittakers, expectations formed. Supporters believed their money would improve the family's lives. They believed the people filming would act responsibly with the support they received. But as the story progressed, critics began claiming the family did not receive the financial benefit many viewers assumed they would. Those claims are still disputed. Some people insist the family did receive help through groceries, supplies, and support. Others argue that the financial benefit was far smaller than the revenue generated by the content itself. The problem is that the public rarely sees the full financial picture in situations like this. Online platforms generate revenue in complicated ways. Advertising, live stream donations, subscriptions, sponsorships. Each channel owns money differently. And unless the creator openly shares those numbers, viewers are left guessing. That uncertainty is exactly what fuels accusations. Because once people suspect money may have been mishandled, every detail becomes suspicious. Why did the family appear to receive small gifts while videos about them reached huge audiences? Why were certain promises made publicly but not clearly documented afterward? Why did the situation eventually escalate into legal involvement? These questions remain central to the controversy, but the videos themselves remain the most powerful piece of the puzzle, because they are the only part of the story everyone has actually seen. And in those recordings, viewers saw something else that many people have not forgotten. They saw the Whittakers together. Before the investigations, before the separation, before the legal cases, the family was living in the same house. Lorraine, Timmy, other relatives, sharing the same space they had shared for years. Some viewers described those moments as evidence that the family was functioning in its own way. They argue that outsiders disrupted something that had existed peacefully for decades. Others see the same footage very differently. They believe the videos exposed living conditions that could not be ignored. They believe intervention was necessary to ensure medical care and safety. Those two interpretations sit at the center of the Whittaker debate. Was the family stable in their own environment, or were they surviving in conditions that required outside help? And because the videos show only fragments of daily life, the answer is not obvious. Another element that complicates the situation is editing. Every video posted online is edited. Moments are chosen. Moments are removed. The final result is always a curated version of reality. That doesn't mean the footage is fake, but it does mean viewers are seeing a story shaped by the person holding the camera. And that is why critics argue that videos alone cannot prove the full truth. They show pieces of reality, but not always the entire context. Still, those pieces have had enormous influence. They shape how viewers understood the Whittaker family. They shaped how donors responded, and they shaped how critics began asking questions about exploitation. Now, as Patrick faces court under home confinement, those same videos are being examined in a different way. Not just as internet content, but potentially as evidence. Because what appears on camera can matter in legal cases. Statements made on video, interactions captured during filming, promises discussed publicly. All of those things can become relevant when courts examine what actually happened. And that possibility adds another layer of tension to the story. Because once legal proceedings begin analyzing online content, the consequences can be very real. The Whittaker story started as a series of videos watched by curious audiences. Now those same recordings may play a role in determining legal responsibility. And that transformation shows just how far the situation has evolved. What began as attention has become accountability. But even as legal questions continue unfolding, another issue remains unresolved. The future of the Whittaker family themselves. Because while viewers debate videos and creators argue about responsibility, the family is no longer living the life they once had. They are separated, under supervision, and navigating a system of care that most viewers will never see. For many people following the Whittaker story, the most painful part of everything that has happened isn't the accusations. It isn't the court dates. It isn't even the arguments between creators online. The hardest part is something much simpler. The family is no longer together. For decades, the Whittakers lived under the same roof in Odd. Their life was not easy. Their home was modest. Sometimes it was chaotic. Sometimes it was uncomfortable. But it was familiar. Lorraine knew where her son was every day. Timmy knew where his mother was every night. The family had their own routines, their own rhythm, their own version of normal. And that version of normal lasted for more than 70 years. Generations grew up in that same environment. Neighbors knew them. The community knew them. Their lives were largely invisible to the outside world, until the internet discovered them. At first, the attention looked like a blessing. People donated. People sent supplies. Some viewers said they felt hopeful for the first time that the family might receive real help. But the same attention that brought help also brought scrutiny. People began asking whether the family had access to proper medical care. They asked whether the home environment was safe. They asked whether vulnerable adults were being adequately protected. Eventually, those questions reached the people responsible for investigating situations like that. Adult Protective Services. Once APS receives reports that vulnerable individuals might be at risk, they cannot simply ignore them. They are required to evaluate the situation. And if they believe intervention is necessary, they have the authority to act. That is exactly what happened in the Whittaker case. Authorities removed members of the household. Assessments began. Medical evaluations were scheduled. And suddenly the family that had lived together for decades was no longer sharing the same home. For supporters of the intervention, this was the right decision. They believe the family will now receive better medical care, better supervision, better living conditions. From that perspective, the separation was necessary in order to protect vulnerable individuals. But for critics, the separation represents something heartbreaking. They see a family that survived poverty, isolation, and hardship together for decades. And they believe outsiders destroyed that bond. They argue that people who lived together their entire lives should not have been separated unless there was immediate danger. This disagreement lies at the center of the emotional conflict surrounding the Whittaker story, because there is no simple way to measure the value of family bonds. Medical care matters. Safety matters. But so does emotional connection. For Lorraine, the sudden absence of her son may be deeply confusing. For Timmy, living somewhere unfamiliar could feel frightening. When individuals spend their entire lives in one environment, change can be overwhelming. Even positive change can feel traumatic. And that is the part of the story many viewers struggle with. Because while arguments continue online about who was right and who was wrong, the people most affected by those decisions are the Whittakers themselves. They are the ones adjusting to new routines, new environments, new caregivers. They are the ones learning how to live without the familiar rhythms they knew for decades. Some people believe that once medical evaluations are complete and living arrangements are stabilized, the family might eventually be reunited in some way. Perhaps supervised visits, perhaps structured living arrangements, perhaps a situation where members of the family can spend time together again. Others believe the separation may become permanent. If authorities determine that certain individuals require specialized care, they may decide that returning to the old living arrangement is not safe. That possibility is difficult for many supporters to accept, because the Whittaker story was never just about poverty. It was about family, a family that stayed together through decades of hardship, a family that survived without much outside help, and a family that now faces a future that looks very different from its past. This emotional tension is why the court case involving Patrick has become so symbolic. For some people, the charges represent accountability for actions that disrupted the family's life. For others, the charges represent a misunderstanding of people who believe they were trying to help. But regardless of which side someone believes, one thing is certain. The Whittaker story has changed permanently. The quiet porch where the family once sat together is no longer the center of their lives. Instead, decisions about their future are being made in offices, hospitals, and courtrooms. Those decisions may ultimately bring better care. They may bring stability, but they cannot recreate the life the family once had. And that is why so many viewers feel conflicted. Because sometimes the line between helping and harming is not as clear as we want it to be. Sometimes good intentions produce painful outcomes. And sometimes a situation that needed attention also contains something fragile that people didn't fully understand until it was gone. The Whittaker story sits exactly in that uncomfortable space, between concern and interference, between protection and separation. And while courts and agencies continue deciding what happens next, one truth remains impossible to ignore. The family that lived together for 70 years now lives in a very different reality. At this point, the Whittaker story has become something far bigger than anyone expected. What began as a glimpse into the life of a struggling Appalachian family has turned into a complicated mix of compassion, controversy, legal battles, and internet activism. And somewhere inside all of that noise are the people who started it all. The Whittaker family. For decades they lived quietly and odd, largely unnoticed by the outside world. Their life was simple and often difficult, but it was familiar. They understood the rhythms of their environment, the people around them, and the routines that shaped their days. Then the internet discovered them. After their story was shared publicly by Mark Laita, millions of viewers suddenly felt connected to a family they had never met. Many people reacted with genuine empathy. They wanted to help. They believed attention could bring resources and support that had never been available before. In some ways, it did. The Whittakers received donations. They received improvements to their home. They received attention that highlighted the struggles faced by many isolated communities across Appalachia. But attention also brings complications. When a story becomes viral, it attracts people with many different motivations. Some want to advocate, some want to investigate, some want to document, and others want to build audiences around the story. That mixture of motivations is what turned the Whittaker situation into something unpredictable. Multiple creators began discussing the family. Different individuals entered their lives claiming they wanted to help. Viewers began donating money through different channels. And eventually the situation became so complex that authorities stepped in to evaluate the well-being of the people involved. Now the Whittaker story sits at the intersection of several difficult questions. What responsibility do content creators have when filming vulnerable individuals? What oversight should exist when money is raised in someone else's name? How should authorities balance safety with the emotional bonds of families who have lived together for decades? There are no easy answers. Some people believe the intervention will ultimately lead to better medical care and safer living conditions. Others believe the separation of the family represents a tragedy that could have been avoided. Both perspectives come from genuine concern. But what this story ultimately shows is how fragile the boundary can be between helping and interfering. When outsiders enter a situation they do not fully understand, even good intentions can produce unexpected consequences. The internet magnifies those consequences because every moment becomes public. Every disagreement becomes amplified. Every accusation spreads faster than facts. That is exactly what has happened in the Whittaker case. Instead of a quiet process focused entirely on the family's well-being, the situation has become a highly visible conflict involving creators, supporters, critics, and legal proceedings. And that conflict has sometimes overshadowed the people who matter most. Timmy, Lorraine, the rest of the family who must now adjust to a life that looks very different from the one they knew. The legal case involving Patrick Roark is only one piece of this story. It may determine accountability for specific actions, but it will not answer every question people have about what happened to the Whittakers. Those answers may take years to fully understand. Because the Whittaker story is not just about one court hearing or one investigation. It is about the larger impact of turning real lives into viral narratives. Stories like this remind us that behind every video and every headline are human beings who must live with the consequences long after the audience moves on. The internet often treats stories as entertainment, but the people inside those stories do not get to turn the screen off. For them, the results are permanent. That is why the final lesson of the Whittaker story may be one of caution. Curiosity can lead to awareness. Awareness can lead to help. But when attention grows too fast and too many people try to take control, the original purpose can disappear. Helping someone requires patience. It requires humility. And sometimes it requires stepping back instead of stepping forward. As the legal process continues and the Whittaker family move through the next phase of their lives, one hope remains shared by many people watching from afar. That the outcome, whatever it may be, finally brings stability to a family that has experienced more public attention than anyone in their position ever expected. Because in the end, the Whittaker story should not be remembered for internet arguments or YouTube rivalries. It should be remembered for whether the people at the center of it were ultimately given the care, dignity, and peace they deserve. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.